A German patrol stumbles on a mud-stained map. It looks routine, almost boring. But within hours, that single sheet of paper will redirect tanks, guns, and entire divisions toward a coastline the Allies never planned to touch. How did one lost map fool an entire army for 60 days? Let's uncover it. The night was quiet over northern France, but inside a dim stone cellar beneath an abandoned farmhouse, a man leaned over a table lit by a single lantern. Rain tapped on the ceiling as if rushing the moment. The man's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to finish. His name would never be written in the official stories. Yet what he carried had the power to move entire armies. On the table lay a map of the French coast. It looked harmless at first glance, with neatly drawn symbols and shaded landing zones. The kind of field map any German officer might consult before breakfast. But this one was different. Every line and angle had been crafted to mislead. It pointed the German high command toward the wrong stretch of shoreline, the wrong harbors, and the wrong defensive preparations. The man working on it was a spy who understood exactly how German intelligence sifted through information, how they trusted documents that felt routine, and how easily confidence could turn into blindness. Outside, the wind carried the distant rumble of artillery drills. Germany was bracing for an Allied landing somewhere along the Atlantic Wall. Hitler's commanders were divided about where the strike would fall. The Allies knew this tension well and they planned to use it. Their best chance was to feed the uncertainty until it hardened into conviction. That pressure was the spy's advantage. His map was designed not to raise suspicion but to feel boring and technical. That was the secret. If the Germans saw a dramatic claim, they would question it. If they found what looked like a staff officer's half-finished notes, they would accept it without hesitation. The spy paused and listened for footsteps. Nothing. He continued, adding small handwritten markings that looked like corrections. A few arrows. Some beach gradients. A narrow inlet that seemed more important than it really was. This attention to detail came from studying German habits, not guesswork. He understood how their planners preferred firm terrain, rapid reinforcement routes, and clear artillery ranges. So he pointed them exactly where they wanted to believe the Allies were coming. Across the channel, American and British analysts waited for confirmation that the map had been placed close enough to German patrol routes to be found. They understood the risk. If the map seemed planted, if it looked like a decoy, the entire deception would collapse. But if it worked, Germany would direct men, guns, tanks, and fortifications toward a coastline that would never see a single Allied soldier. The effect could buy time measured not in hours but in months. In the cellar, the spy folded the map once, then again, making sure the creases looked natural. He rubbed a little dirt into the corners. He even scuffed it with a boot heel so it resembled something used in the field. Authenticity mattered. Germans trusted documents that carried wear. A crisp sheet raised suspicion. A worn one felt like truth. When he stepped outside, the sky was black and heavy. He moved through the field with careful steps, moving along a route he had memorized. To anyone watching, he looked like a courier carrying dispatches. In a way he was. Just not for the side most expected. Minutes later he reached a ditch where German patrols occasionally passed. He knelt, made sure no one was around, and placed the folded map near a rock where a boot could easily kick it loose. Then he left without looking back. His job was done. An hour after dawn, a German sergeant spotted the paper while scanning the area after a routine patrol. It lay half buried in mud, damp but readable. He called over an officer, who inspected it with interest. The markings looked proper. The handwriting matched what German staff officers used. There were no strange mistakes, no odd phrasing, nothing that hinted at Allied hands. It looked exactly like it belonged to them. The officer brought it to headquarters. Senior analysts pored over it, comparing it against their own expectations. They saw a pattern of landing routes that looked plausible. They saw terrain notations that matched what they already believed. The map did not challenge their assumptions. It confirmed them. That was the brilliance of it. Across France, German divisions were already stretched thin between responsibilities. Rommel had argued that the Allies would strike early and hard, and he wanted armored divisions closer to the coast. Others believed the real threat was still weeks away and far to the north. The map nudged the argument in one direction. It made the northern coast look like the obvious target. It made the Allied plan appear predictable. The Germans believed they were reading a lost piece of their own intelligence, not a trap laid by someone who understood their pride. German staff officers pinned the map to their planning boards by the afternoon. A cluster of red markers appeared around the area the spy wanted them to defend. Reinforcement orders followed. Movements of tanks and artillery were scheduled. Defensive construction timelines shifted. Coastal batteries were redirected. In a single day, an entire response plan began to pivot. Across the channel, the Allies watched the signals intercepts coming out of France. Traffic increased around the wrong coastline. Units were alerted. Supply depots moved. The deception had been swallowed whole. The American analysts studying the intercepts kept their reactions calm, but inside the room there was a quiet excitement. They knew how difficult it was to sway a military machine as rigid as Germany's. Yet the shift was unmistakable. The Germans were preparing for a landing miles from the real invasion point. Every hour they invested in that wrong location was an hour they would not spend strengthening the true target. The spy who planted the map did not see any of this. His work was invisible by design. He moved through occupied territory like a shadow, carrying nothing that could betray him. But the effects of his small act grew by the day. A single sheet of paper was steering concrete, steel, and thousands of German soldiers toward the wrong fight. For the Germans, the map felt like an internal discovery. For the Allies, it set in motion a chain of movements that would shape the coming battle. The tension rose on both sides without anyone realizing that one misplaced document was quietly preparing the ground for a massive imbalance. And as the days passed, the German high command grew more confident that they understood the Allied plan. That confidence was exactly what the Allies needed. The morning sun stretched over the northern coastline of France, revealing miles of concrete bunkers, steel obstacles, and half-finished fortifications. German engineers were working at a frantic pace, tightening bolts, leveling gun emplacements, and marking firing sectors in chalk. The air smelled of wet sand and diesel. None of them knew they were preparing for an attack that would never arrive. Inside a coastal command post, officers gathered around a long table covered with maps and reports. The recovered map sat in the center like a crown jewel. Its edges were still dusty from the field, which only made it feel more genuine. The senior officers leaned in, tracing the penciled arrows with their fingers as they discussed landing craft, tides, and artillery coverage. Their certainty grew with every hour. German doctrine relied heavily on the belief that Allied planners followed predictable patterns. The map matched those expectations perfectly. It pointed to a coastline the Germans already considered ideal for an amphibious assault. Wide beaches, flat approaches, and roads that led directly inland. Everything about it reinforced their existing views. Confidence felt natural. Messages were sent to Berlin. Requests for reinforcements followed. High-level commanders debated the timing of the invasion, but almost all agreed that the attack would focus on this northern sector. The map didn't create a new belief, it solidified one that had been simmering for weeks. That was its power. It made the Germans feel smart, not fooled. On the ground, troops were told to prepare for heavy action. Tank crews inspected their engines in the cold morning air. Gunners calibrated the elevation on their coastal batteries. Infantrymen stacked crates of ammunition inside bunkers. Some soldiers joked that the Allies would be foolish to come here, but most knew something real was happening. Orders this detailed didn't appear out of thin air. A convoy of fortification materials rolled in by midday. Steel beams clattered as they were unloaded. Workers installed additional anti-tank obstacles along the shoreline, hammering in stakes and welding supports. The coastline looked more fearsome by the hour. Commanders felt reassured knowing this section of the Atlantic Wall was strengthening faster than expected. The map had sparked urgency. Across the channel, Allied analysts watched the German response unfold through intercepted radio traffic. They monitored troop shifts, construction reports, and supply deliveries. Each new intercept confirmed that the Germans were doubling down on the wrong area. It felt like watching a giant machine turn in the direction you wanted, slow but unstoppable. The Americans studying the signals worked with calm focus. They didn't celebrate. They tracked patterns. Every movement told them how deeply the deception was taking root. More than one analyst leaned back in their chair as the evidence piled up, quietly impressed by how a simple document had pushed an entire military apparatus off balance. Meanwhile, the spy moved carefully through occupied territory, keeping his head down. He blended into the landscape like a laborer, a messenger, a passerby, whoever he needed to be. He never asked what the Germans were doing in response to the planted map. He didn't need to. He had done his job and he trusted the Allies to read the signs. The less he knew, the safer he remained. German officers continued to discuss the coastal plans late into the evening. They highlighted areas they believed would see the heaviest fighting. They noted landing craft symbols and penciled timings. One officer, a veteran of early war campaigns, pointed at the map's shaded beach zone and explained how the terrain offered the Allies a perfect landing corridor. His colleagues nodded. They repeated the same logic to their superiors. By the end of the day, the wrong coastline had become the center of their defensive plan. Even the skeptics found it hard to argue. The map felt too normal, too detailed, too aligned with their own thinking to ignore. It didn't scream deception. It whispered reassurance. Farther inland, tank battalions were placed on alert. Engines rumbled as mechanics tested gears and fuel lines. These armored units were supposed to be held in reserve for the real invasion, but now many of them were reassigned closer to the northern beaches. The shift stretched supply lines and altered training schedules. They were preparing for a fight that was never going to materialize. Without realizing it, Germany was locking itself into a defensive posture based on misinformation. At one airfield, pilots received updated reconnaissance grid coordinates. They believed they were being positioned to support an upcoming battle. Aircraft were moved, hangars reorganized, fuel trucks redirected. The entire operation centered around a coastline the Allies had no intention of approaching. The wrongness of it all made the deception even more effective. Every adjustment deepened the trap. Yet the Germans felt stronger, not weaker. They felt prepared. Across France, soldiers talked about the coming storm. Rumors moved faster than orders. Some said the Allies were days away. Others claimed the attack would happen at night under cloud cover. None of them knew their expectations were being shaped by a single piece of intelligence planted by someone they'd never meet. In London, the American deception planners observed the situation with steady concentration. Their goal wasn't to humiliate the enemy. They wanted to divert resources, stretch defenses, and create hesitation. If the Germans believed the wrong threat, the real attack would face thinner resistance. That meant fewer American casualties. That was the purpose behind every line on the planted map. The longer the Germans reinforced the wrong coastline, the more time the Allies gained to prepare the real operation. They needed weeks of planning. They were getting months. Back in the command post along the French coast, the map remained pinned to the board. Officers studied it again before closing the evening briefing. It sat there like a quiet authority, shaping decisions even when no one mentioned it directly. Sometimes the strongest influence comes from a detail so subtle that people forget to question it. Outside, the shoreline looked peaceful under the moonlight. Waves rolled in and out, tapping softly against the obstacles rising from the sand. German floodlights scanned the surface of the water. The coast seemed ready. But it was ready for the wrong battle. The officers locked up the command post and headed out into the night, confident in their preparations. They believed their defenses pointed in the right direction. They believed their intelligence was reliable. They believed their predictions matched the enemy's ambitions. Those beliefs would hold for 60 days. All because of one map. The Channel looked calm under a gray morning sky, but the Allied command rooms in England were anything but quiet. Radios buzzed, typewriters rattled, and analysts leaned over intercepted reports with the steady focus of people who knew the stakes. Every fresh signal from German headquarters offered a new clue about how convincingly the fake map had taken hold. The room didn't erupt in excitement. It didn't need to. The analysts understood the value of silence. They watched and waited as the deception folded deeper into the German system. On a long table near the center of the room, officers studied the latest decoded message. German units were being instructed to rotate patrols more frequently along the wrong coastline. Artillery batteries were asked to reconfirm firing ranges. A line of bunkers was being upgraded faster than scheduled. Everything pointed to a single conclusion. Germany was preparing for a major landing in the exact area the Allies wanted them to fear. An American intelligence officer traced the German reinforcement routes with the tip of his pen. He saw how trains were shifting north, how fuel depots were swelling near the false invasion zone, and how field hospitals were being expanded in places that would never see battle. He didn't smile, but he exhaled in a way that said the plan was working better than expected. Every unnecessary reinforcement was a gift. Every misallocation of German armor was one less division standing between American troops and a foothold on the continent. Outside the intelligence sector, Allied engineers and planners worked under an enormous burden of urgency. They had to prepare for the actual landing, the one the Germans thought was a decoy. Supplies were being stockpiled in secret depots. Landing craft were being inspected and repaired. Pilots practiced low-altitude runs across stretches of English countryside that resembled French fields. Hundreds of decisions were made every hour, each one tied to the hope that the deception would hold a little longer. It was holding better than anyone predicted. Deep inside France, German soldiers dug in along the wrong beaches. They hauled sandbags, drove posts into the ground and sharpened barbed wire defenses. The shift in resources changed the rhythm of their days. When trucks full of anti-tank mines arrived, commanders assumed the high command had new information. The soldiers didn't question it. They followed orders and strengthened the wrong coastline with the seriousness of men expecting to meet an invasion head-on. Their work created an illusion of strength. To them, the heavy defenses meant they were exactly where they were needed. To the Allies, it meant the real invasion site was falling further out of focus for the Germans. German reconnaissance aircraft made repeated passes over the channel. Pilots scanned for Allied ships near the false landing zone. Cloud cover forced them low, and they returned to their bases claiming they saw signs of movement. They were likely just spotting shadows on the water or routine Allied patrols, but they interpreted everything through the lens of the map that had reshaped their expectations. When intelligence officers reviewed the pilot's sketches, they felt vindicated. They saw what they wanted to see. The deception tightened its hold. In Berlin, high-ranking officers debated strategic predictions. Some argued for keeping armored divisions inland until the exact landing site became certain. Others pushed for forward deployment along the coast, citing the captured map as their justification. Arguments grew tense, but the map always resurfaced in the discussion. It didn't silence disagreements, it steered them. It anchored the belief that the Allies were planning an assault that matched the document's markings. Confidence settled in slowly like moisture creeping into a wall. Across the channel, the American planners studied every movement. What mattered most wasn't simply how many German units moved to the wrong coast. It was how convinced the Germans were becoming. Conviction was stronger than fear. Fear made people scatter. Conviction made them commit. The Germans were committing. Inside one Allied planning room, a senior officer reviewed the sequence of intercepted messages. He tapped the reports with the back of his hand and made a calm observation. The Germans weren't just deploying forces, they were building a belief. And belief, once built, rarely shifted quickly. That meant the real coastline would remain lightly defended longer than the Allies dared hope. Meanwhile, the spy who planted the map continued living in the shadows of occupied France. He avoided German checkpoints, slipped through side streets, and made contact with local resistance only when absolutely necessary. He didn't know how far the deception had spread, but he trusted the Allies to read the signals. To him, survival mattered more than updates. A captured spy offered no help to anyone. His anonymity was part of the strength of the operation. No sudden arrests or suspicious disappearances signaled that the Germans doubted the map. The quiet was proof that it had blended into their system unnoticed. Back along the fortified coastline, German soldiers followed orders they believed were grounded in reliable intelligence. Tank crews performed drills, engines rumbling through the early hours. Infantry units practiced storming the dunes, convinced they needed to repel an Allied force that would come charging onto their beaches any day. Officers reviewed defensive plans with confidence and a sense of urgency. Everything aligned with the false narrative planted weeks before. The wrongness of their preparations made them work harder, not less. As days turned into weeks, the effects grew. German supply chains bent toward the northern coast. Fuel stores shifted. Ammunition stockpiles grew. Medical units packed kits and relocated. Every movement drained strength from the real invasion site and poured it into an empty shadow. American analysts noted that some German commanders were beginning to express impatience, arguing that the invasion should have happened by now. They questioned the timing, not the location. That was a sign the deception was now self-sustaining. The map wasn't a suspicion. It had become an expectation. Even reports from German military weather stations, meant to assess when an amphibious assault was most likely, were interpreted through the map's lens. Officers told themselves the Allies were simply waiting for the right tide. They didn't consider that they might be waiting somewhere else. The Allied planners monitored this with disciplined calm. They needed the deception to hold not just days but long enough to set the real plan in motion without drawing new German attention. The longer the Germans stared at the wrong horizon, the weaker their ability became to adapt when the real moment came. The trap wasn't built on a sudden trick. It was built on the Germans trusting themselves. That was the brilliance behind the map. It didn't shout. It nudged. It didn't invent new fears. It confirmed old ones. And that confirmation had now swept through coastal defenses, armored divisions, and air reconnaissance like a quiet tide. 60 days of misplaced certainty. 60 days of strengthening the wrong shoreline. 60 days of confidence that would collapse the moment the real boots touched the right sand. And the Allies watched it all unfold, patient and steady, knowing the Germans were preparing for the battle that would never come. Dawn crept over the English coastline with a soft glow that didn't match the intensity inside the Allied war rooms. Officers moved briskly, checking final schedules and radio codes. Mechanics tightened last bolts on landing craft. Soldiers sat quietly with their gear, listening to the distant hum of engines warming up. Every man in the room knew the real assault was about to begin. The greatest deception of the war had held long enough. Now the weight shifted from secrecy to action. Across the channel, the Germans watched the wrong horizon. Their fortified northern coastline stood ready, bristling with guns, mines, and reinforced bunkers. Patrols scanned the sea through binoculars, expecting silhouettes of Allied ships at any moment. Officers reassured themselves that their intelligence was sound. The captured map had guided German strategy for weeks. To them it felt like common sense. The beaches they defended looked perfect for an invasion, and the Allies had a history of choosing the most direct route. The real landing site, miles away, remained eerily calm. Only a handful of German troops patrolled the area. Their defenses were thin, built slowly over time without the surge of reinforcements the false map had triggered elsewhere. The officers assigned to the region felt overlooked, almost forgotten. They had no idea that fate had placed them at the edge of the war's most decisive moment. Back in England, American planners gathered around a large table covered in final maps. They didn't look at the fake one, the one that had guided German thinking. They looked at the real terrain, the tides, the moonlight, and the narrow window of weather that would determine the success of the landing. If the Germans had shifted even a fraction of their resources south, this day would be far more dangerous. But they hadn't. They were staring at a coastline that would remain silent. Hours before the landings, Allied aircraft roared across the channel. Bombers and fighters streaked toward the false coastline, dropping decoy flares and chaff to mimic an incoming armada. German radar screens lit up with signals. Operators reported heavy movement. Officers at the northern command posts heard the news and stiffened with anticipation. They ordered their men to prepare for the first wave of the attack. Gunners swung their artillery to pre-planned firing angles. Infantry squads took positions along trenches. Tank crews climbed into their machines, gripping the controls. The tension rose like a tide. Every soldier waited for the silhouette of landing craft breaking through the haze. But the silhouettes never came. The lights in the sky faded. The echoes died. The water remained untouched. Still, the Germans didn't question it. They convinced themselves the Allies were probing, testing, preparing. They kept their attention on the northern horizon. Far from that imagined battlefield, the real invasion force cut across the water under the cover of early dawn. Thousands of American, British, and Canadian troops moved with quiet precision. The engines hummed low. Officers whispered instructions. The men knew the dangers ahead, but they also knew they weren't sailing into the teeth of the densest German firepower. A calm that wasn't natural lay over the real landing site. It was the calm left behind by German certainty. Back in France, at the heavily fortified coast shaped by the planted map, an impatient German officer finally allowed himself a moment of doubt. He stepped outside the bunker and scanned the water again. The sea looked empty. The air felt still. He checked his watch, then returned to his command board. The map pinned above it stared back at him, its markings still crisp. Logic told him the Allies should have struck by now. The situation didn't feel right. But he didn't pull back the reinforcements. He didn't call for a reassessment. He couldn't challenge a conviction built over 2 months of planning. When belief has been shaped so deeply, discomfort isn't enough to break it. As the first Allied landing craft reached the real shore, German lookouts in that sector finally saw the truth forming on the horizon. They raised binoculars and froze. Ships. Thousands of them. The officer in charge scrambled to send reports, but the communications network lagged. The nearest strong armored divisions were positioned along the false invasion zone, hours away from where they were needed. Warning messages traveled slowly through confused channels. Some commanders dismissed early alerts as local errors. Others assumed the real attack was still coming in the north. The deception had worked too well. The German division meant to smash the first wave was stuck miles from the real beach. The artillery units supposed to break the landing craft apart were aligned with the wrong oceanfront. The tank battalions capable of driving the Allies back into the sea were idling on ground that would never taste battle. By the time German high command realized the truth, the Allies were already fighting inland. American troops pushed across the sand under relentless fire, but the defenses facing them lacked the density and coordination that would have hardened the fight into an impossible wall. Every hour gained at the real beach came from the 60 days lost at the false one. In Berlin, the mood shifted from confidence to disbelief. Officers demanded explanations. How had they committed so many resources to the wrong place? How had so many divisions been anchored to a false prediction? Reports poured in, each one confirming the same reality: the map they trusted was never theirs. The deception wasn't discovered in a dramatic moment. It was realized slowly, painfully, as commanders pieced together how their assumptions had consumed their strategy. The false map had blended with their existing fears and expectations so smoothly that no one had questioned it. The mistake wasn't just a matter of intelligence. It was a matter of pride. While the Germans struggled to reposition their forces, the Allies kept pushing forward. American engineers built temporary roads. Artillery units unloaded onto the beach. Infantry moved through hedgerows and fields. The foothold they established that morning wouldn't be lost. Across the real landing zone, the cost was heavy and painful, but the breach held because the enemy had been preparing for a different war. Back in the quiet shadows of France, the spy who placed the map never saw the results with his own eyes. He kept moving, avoiding patrols, trying to stay alive. But the effect of his work rippled across Europe. His simple act, one folded piece of paper placed in the right ditch at the right hour, had shaped the direction of armies and the fate of thousands. When the dust settled, history would point to tanks, ships, and soldiers. But beneath all of that was the quiet power of misdirection. A deception so simple it felt real. So ordinary it felt true. So convincing it held the attention of an entire military machine for 60 days. In war, firepower wins battles. But sometimes a single map wins a coastline. And for the Allies, that stolen time became the doorway into Europe.